Professor Manuel Aalbers é professor de Geografia Social e Econômica na Universidade de Bélgica, coordenador de pesquisa sobre o complexo imobiliário financeiro, campo de interseção entre o mercado imobiliário, incluindo habitação social, mercado financeiro e ação do Estado. O Aalbers fará a palestra Real Estate Financial Complex, o complexo imobiliário financeiro. Thank you very much for coming here. It's a pleasure to receive you here at our school. And nós planejamos da seguinte maneira: a gente vai fazer a palestra mais ou menos uns 45 minutos, depois a gente abre para o debate, ok? Perguntas, etc. After we talk, around 45 minutes, take your time, we open for the debate. Okay. Impressions?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
It's better to use this microphone.
I will try to stand, and I think my voice is loud enough to not use the microphone.
It's because we're recording.
You don't need it for the recording.
Yes.
In that case, let's see. Just so I don't start the screen. Okay. Denise, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. I will get back to this in a minute. I just put this on so you have something to look at, but it will come back in a few slides from now. So I didn't want to present the same as in São Carlos last week, because I know that some of you were there. So there might be a few slides that will be the same, but I tried to do a different talk. Also, I gave a webinar last month, and many of the people presenting were from Brazil, and many of the Brazilians were from Belo, Horizonte. So also, I didn't want to repeat that talk, which is about the financialization of housing. So I'm doing a different talk, which is not really a paper. It's an overview of a research program. So at each step, I will give some illustrations to show how I'm developing this research program, how we've developed it in the last few years. So it's not a paper necessarily with a beginning and the end, but you will see the program hopefully hangs together somewhat logically, and if not, you can ask me about that. Rather than starting from theory and then moving to methods and then moving to examples, I like to start from examples and then sort of theorize up. So these are two companies. Do you know what these companies do?
Yes.
What do they do?
Tires and cars.
Tires and cars? Yeah, anyone else? No? So there's always someone who says calendars for Pirelli. But not in this audience apparently, but people know exactly what I'm talking about. Actually, Pirelli is mostly a real estate firm who also makes tires. General Motors is mostly a financial firm that also makes cars. So I started with this example to show how we think about the economy is not necessarily how the economy really works. And this affects also urban development, cities, real estate development, more widely speaking. So Pirelli is actually known in Italy for a network of real estate agents called Pirelli Franchising. They also are a real estate developer themselves. This is in the middle, you see the white thing is part of the old factory of Pirelli in the north of the city of Milan. And the old factory is no longer active. For a number of years it was a brownfield. It was waiting to be redeveloped. And what Pirelli did, they lobbied the city of Milan and the province of Milan to put a lot of money in the area. They upgraded the train station. They made a new metro line and a new tram line. And because of that, they now have a new hub in the city. They built a whole new university there. The public university of Milan was split into two. So the University of Milan still exists, and this is Milano Bicocca. It was built on the old Pirelli site. And so what they basically did is they redeveloped their old site. And so they started from their own site, becoming a real estate developer, rather than only a company that makes tires. And in Italy, if you ask people about Pirelli, they think now as much about real estate as they think about finance. General Motors started a long time ago with General Motors accountancy company. And it sounds like an accountancy company, but really was another financial company. Just imagine you produce cars. Cars are expensive. So what's the best thing to do? You also offer people money. So General Motors very early on started offering people car loans so they could buy the cars. General Motors accountancy company became at some point an independent company. So it was no longer part of General Motors and became known as GMAC in the US. And GMAC became one of the largest subprime lenders. So one of the lenders that gave a lot of loans to poor people, overpriced loans, high interest rates. this was one of the biggest ones in the US, but originally a subsidiary of General Motors. And even after GMAC became independent from General Motors started again with a new financial company, General Motors Finance, and again it became an important part. And when in the crisis in the US, 2007, 2009, General Motors had to be bailed out, it was not just because their cars were not up to the 21st century standards. Some of the cars were even too polluting to be exported to China, which says a lot because many Chinese cars until 10 years ago were not allowed into the global north. But now American cars were considered too polluting even for the Chinese market. But one of the other things General Motors had to be saved for because a lot of their money was into finance. So General Motors had to be saved in the crisis. Also GMAC, although independent, had to be saved in the crisis. So we see the Treasury come in, is saving General Motors, is saving GMAC, and a little part of the presentation to the right is falling off because there should be a U and an S here from Severus. I don't know if it can be moved a little bit.
It's the chair. It's the chair.
It's the chair. That makes sense. That's very easy to solve. That's a good problem to have. So Severus bought up the part of GMAC. So the old vendor was bought up by a private equity fund. Does anyone know about Severus? This is one of the biggest companies in the world, and it's one of the most unknown companies in the world. I don't know if everyone knows what private equity funds do, but I will say it very shortly. They buy up firms for a lower price as possible and sell for a higher price as possible, which is the most pure definition of speculation. In the meantime, they may chop up the company, they may merge it, they may do all kinds of other things with it, but their basic model is to buy low and sell high. So this is what they did with GMAC. So all of a sudden, Severus, who is also in healthcare, they're in education, they're in energy, they're a utility firm, they do everything as long as they can make money on it. It's not the kind of high-speed trading where they own it for a few seconds, but they own every company for a few years, and that's how they go. So they became also a large member overnight. And one of the other things that Severus did in the years before the financial crisis, they bought up the largest social housing landlord of Berlin, called GFW. 67,000 units of affordable housing, subsidized housing, quasi-governmental housing was bought up also by Severus. So you can see how all these different things connect. So what I'm trying to show here is that manufacturing is not what we think of. It may actually be real estate or it may be finance. Also, what we think of what companies do, there's all these kind of linkages between real estate, between finance and the state. And then there's a link between places. A company like Severus, based in the New York City metropolitan area, buys up an American lender, but also buys up social housing in Berlin. So what I'm trying to show is that the way that we think about all this is not the same anymore. I see I forgot one step. DSW, later on, of course, was sold because Severus does everything just for a few years. They don't do everything for the long term. And they sold it to a housing fund that listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange called Deutsche Wohnen. Deutsche Wohnen was started by Deutsche Bank, the largest bank of Germany. So you see also the connection here to the banking world and the real estate. So all these things are connected. So I'm doing this partly to confuse you a little bit in the beginning, but to make you aware, it's not as simple as we think it is. If we have measurements of the economy, they often measure manufacturing separate from finance. So General Motors will be considered a manufacturing company. Pirelli will be considered a manufacturing company. So it's not just the way we think about the economy, but also the way we think about cities that's no longer up to date. It's also the way that our statistics from government agencies are no longer up to date. So this is the basic scheme of what I mean with the real estate financial complex. Of course, it's modeled the concept after the military-industrial complex that looked at the connections between defense industry, the military industry, the US government, and a lot of ties between them, revolving doors of people who move from government to military, from military to the arms industry. And we see the same happening between real estate, finance, and the state. And then what happens, the literature in political economy, interdisciplinary literature, with participating by political scientists, economists, but also geographers, sociologists, they have traditionally looked at economics. Often at the national level, they looked at economics, and it included finance, although finance was typically not the most important thing they looked at. But what makes political economists different than pure economists is that they also look very much at the state. And therefore also the name political economy is always about how the state and the market work together. So they have a tradition of working on finance. On the other hand, a tradition that probably most of us will be more familiar with, urban studies, and within urban studies, a small literature, what we could call critical real estate studies. People like Susan Feinstein, who've written a lot really about being in the real estate sector and doing analysis. Well, most of the real estate studies are actually done outside urban studies by specialized economists who don't necessarily have a critical perspective. There are a few exceptions, but then we can put them in the same group if we need. So they have looked a lot at housing and real estate more widely speaking, so also offices, malls, leisure. They've looked at all these things, but very much at the local level. So they haven't looked at the national level, they haven't looked much at finance. So we need to bring together two different interdisciplinary fields, political economy and urban studies. We need to bring together different levels of analysis, global, national, local, and maybe even within the city, even smaller urban projects, neighborhoods, individual developments. And we need to bring together the studies on real estate and those on finance. So there's a lot of things that need to be brought together to be able to do this. So the way that I've organized the research project is in a number of cases, in a number of countries. And the first 6 were all people who either full-time or most of the time worked with me in the research group in Leuven. And most of them are PhD students, except the last one is a postdoc. It was hard to find a good PhD student who spoke both good English and Chinese. So we got a postdoc in the end. But you can see there's combinations of countries, and I wanted to make the project comparative, not just at the macro level, but within each project. That's why most people have 2 countries. And then we also work together with a number of other people. I should have added one more country here, which is Lebanon, where I have another friend who worked there, was added not, was sort of added later, never officially as a partner for the project. But some of these other people were partners in the project. So you see there's a lot of European countries, but also a number of other countries. It's partly because the initial funding, the largest grant that I could use to build up the group was from the European Research Council. And although they don't necessarily ask that all the research is in Europe, it does help a little bit, of course. So then what I did, I developed 7 propositions. It's not really a hypothesis. Each of them is something that I try to show in the project and that the individual people have tried to show for different countries. So what I will do, I will go through the different propositions, sometimes one by one, sometimes like here 2 at the same time. And I will pick the examples from different countries as illustrations. I could have done it on one particular country, but if I would have done it on Brazil, it would have been very risky, because you would all know much more than me. If I would have done on any other country, it would have just been a talk about that country, so I want to take some interesting examples from different countries to tell you a story. So before I continue with the example, the first claim is very, very straightforward. Real estate and finance have grown at the relative expense of other economic sectors. We can measure that as a share of GDP, so a share of the economy of a country, how much money goes on in these sectors. We can do it more specifically for the profits that are made in these sectors, but we can also do it for employment. How many people are working in these sectors compared to other sectors of the economy? For instance, compared to manufacturing. It doesn't say anything about the connection. It just says there's 2 sectors of the economy that I believe have grown in many countries. Not necessarily in all countries, and not necessarily always both of them. But it could be that both of them are growing. That means the correlated doesn't mean it's a causation. So then the second one says that the 2 of them are increasingly interdependent. The second one is much trickier. The first one, you can find some statistics that in many countries are there. You need to critically assess them. They don't always mean what they do. As General Motors may be in the wrong category, as Pirelli may be in the wrong category. But probably it's an understatement. So if you find evidence for an increase of real estate and finance, it's very likely still to be an undercount of how much the increase is. Because of these countries will not be counted. The second one is a little bit more complicated because you need to combine different kinds of methods. I won't discuss those in detail. I will just go to the examples. So the first graph try just to look at the one that starts at the top left, that line, and goes down. I made these for publication, so they had to be in black and white. Of course, for the PowerPoint, color would have been nice too. And I see on these little dots, it doesn't show the one, but the line that starts at the top and goes down is manufacturing. And it shows it in the top graph for the US and the bottom graph for the UK. The reason that the picture is a little different is because in the US it starts in 47, And in the UK, the graph starts in 1970 purely for availability of data. And they both go on to 2013 or so. And what we see very clearly in both cases that the contribution of the manufacturing sector to the entire economy is shrinking all those years. It's even shrinking more dramatically in the UK. This may partly be that it really shrank more in the UK, which we think it does, but the statistics are a little bit different, so I don't want to make big conclusions about that. But it shows this happens. We can do this for many other countries. For most countries, we will see quite a similar picture, although it's more, the UK is one of the more dramatic cases that we see the decline of manufacturing. Then you don't have to look at all the three other lines. One of them is real estate, one of them is finance, and you see, and then the third one is real estate and finance combined. So you see them going up, all three of them. In the US, they quite steadily go up. In the UK, they're a little bit more erratic. But in both cases, if you just look at the combined line, so this one or this one, they go up in both cases. So between the 1940s in the US and the UK 1970s, up until a few years ago, these sectors have become a larger part of the economy. Again, it doesn't show the correlation yet, and it doesn't show the causation yet, it just shows that it's true for both these sectors. And what is also interesting, that if you look at the decline of manufacturing, it's bigger than the rise of real estate and finance. So yes, they make up for some of the losses in the economy of manufacturing, but not that deep. Then in the next graph, we do the same but then for employment, and then actually the picture becomes much more problematic. We see in both cases one line going down quite a bit. That's jobs in manufacturing. And then we see the other three lines. In the UK, they're almost stable. In the US, one of them goes up a little bit, and one of them is almost not viewable. But the growth in employment is very limited in real estate and finance, which means that they do take up a larger part of the economy, but they don't create new jobs, by and large. So there are some extra jobs created, but the extra jobs created are very small compared to the number of jobs that we lose in manufacturing. But they do pick up a bigger part of the economy. So what does it mean? There's a smaller number of people basically making more money. That's the basic conclusion. And we don't know if that spreads throughout the financial sector and the real estate sector, or it's just a few people on top. It's probably for these sectors a little bit of both. In the financial sector, in general, people are well paid, but on top they're extremely well paid. So this is the problem that we face in many countries today. And it's true also for many middle-income countries, although the picture is not as dramatic because manufacturing has not declined as much in many other countries. But we see also fewer jobs in some of those sectors. Now I try to show how real estate and finance are actually also becoming more interrelated. So real estate investment trusts, I assume most of you will know what they are. Very briefly, it's a real estate fund that listed on the stock exchange. There are other types of funds that are also listed on the stock exchange, but the real estate investment trust, by definition, it is listed on the stock exchange. So it's being operated as if it's any other company listed on the stock exchange. And often most of these companies get a lot of their funding. The people who own the stocks are very often large funds, like pension funds, for instance, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds. I'll get back to them in a few slides. So what we basically see is the bars are the number of REITs in the US, and we see some increase and decline, but we don't see a very clear picture. Over the years, the number of REITs goes up, goes down, and then goes up again. Here's the crisis of 2007, 2009, and afterwards today. But if you look at the line, it's the market capitalization, so how much money is in the REITs. And then you see from the 70s, it's almost non-existent, even though the number of REITs is quite going up. Then we see in the 80s, the number of REITs going up, market capitalization going up a bit too. But then we start seeing something happening here. There's a low point here around the turn of the century, and then the line starts going up very steep, even though the number of REITs is actually for a few years going down. Then the number of REITs explodes, but the market capitalization stays the same. And then actually the crisis market capitalization goes down, the number of REITs, but then this is the interesting thing. You think this is the bubble, right? This is the bubble happening in real estate. Then look at this bubble. And we know that since 2015 the line has gone up again. So it went down a little bit, 13 and 14, and it's going up again. So the bubble we're building up now is actually much larger than the bubble before 2007, 2009. Some people say it's not a bubble. We can have a long discussion about that. I do believe it's a bubble. I don't have time to explain it in that. But here you see very clearly, if you just look at the number of REITs, there's not a dramatic picture. Do you look at the market capitalization, there's a huge bubble going on here. or youth growth. Here a picture of different REITs in the world. The picture is from, I think, 2013 or 14, so it's a little bit outdated. But it shows in orange the countries that have listed REITs. And you see Brazil has been since 1993, which is actually relatively soon. Many countries in Western Europe are much later actually than Brazil with introducing the legislation to make it possible. Because something I won't discuss in detail today, but one part of my argument about this is that regulation from the state is very important to push these sectors. So the whole argument about finance and real estate has become possible through deregulation is not true. If you want to do more securitization, if you want to introduce REITs, for all of these things you need to introduce regulation. New regulation is necessary to roll out these models. And the REITs, they have to be more or less the same in every country to be able to be called REITs. But of course, the existing patterns in real estate finance are not the same in every country, so they always need to be adapted a little bit to the context. And then you see all the orange dots, they're spread out, but many of them are actually in the early 2000s. So that same period that we see the high growth in the US is when we see many countries adopting them. And in some cases, this is also a lobby from the US real estate industry, sometimes through the US government for other countries to push to do so. And Brazil was the first one in '93 in Latin America, but then you see the blue countries are countries that 3 or 4 years ago were about to implement it. Then you also see Mexico and Costa Rica, and there's other countries now. Argentina has in the meantime joined this. And many European countries you actually see 2007, 2009. The Netherlands was extremely fast, 1969. I think it's the first country after the US. Even the UK was only 2007. But in the Netherlands, there were no REITs for a few decades. So the legislation was introduced in 69, but it took decades before the first REIT existed. So this doesn't say anything about how important the REITs are. It just says that the legislation allows them. So this is basically a pattern of the globalization of regulation. Then this is a more complicated graph. Just look at the left bar. I started in the beginning with the example from Siberius, the private equity fund from New York that was buying up not only GMAC, the US lender, but also social housing in Berlin. And that's actually here. GSW Berlin, 66,700 units were sold in one transaction from being owned by the government, by the state government of Berlin, sold in one transaction to a private equity fund. The whole list to the left are all non-profits. Some of them are government-owned, some of them are owned by other non-profit organizations, some are independent. A few of them were owned by companies who were having it as company housing for their workers, but also on a non-profit basis, because that gave them tax advantages in the regulation if they weren't overcharging their own employees. So you see the whole list there, and this happens throughout Germany. The discourse in Germany is very much that this is an East German thing, the former communist part of Germany. But actually, this happens throughout Germany. And the state in Germany where it happened the most is the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is all the way in West Germany, bordering the Netherlands. And there also the biggest transaction took place, which is this one. 93,000 units were sold in one transaction. So you see here the years 97 to 2016. We tried to map them. I did that with a PhD student, John Weiber. His last name is there in the paper in which we put this table. And then what you see is they all start with public ownership, which is cheating a little bit because, as I said, some are public, some are non-profits, but we simplified it a little bit. And then between 1998 and 2007, they are all bought up by investment banks, hedge funds, private equity funds. And this happens for about 1.5 million housing units in Germany. So if you think it's a country of 80 million people, so you have about 35 million housing units. So it's not like it's most of the housing units, it's still 1.5 million housing units within a period of less than 10 years are being completely moved away from being affordable housing and are completely moved not just in the private sector, but in the private sector run by financial institutions. So Nordbank is a bank, Oaktree Investment is a hedge fund, Siberius, I already mentioned, is a private equity fund, and they use money from a company called Whitehall, and Whitehall is a subsidiary of Goldman Sachs, so another investment bank. Deutsche Ellington was the German subsidiary of a British hedge fund, Terra Firma. Pfeiffer's Group, I think, is also a hedge fund, either US or UK. Fortress is another hedge fund. Tag Immobilien directly went into a real estate firm. Here you see Blackstone coming back, asset management group, and then you see between Blackstone another group comes in, Prelios, which is originally a subsidiary from Pirelli, the Italian company, but then became an independent real estate company, and they bought it together with a company that was owned by Deutsche Bank. So you see all these banks and financial institutions come in, and then what happens? In 2007, the crisis hits. The crisis doesn't really hit Germany. Germany does very well in the crisis, but all these financial institutions, except one, are all based in the UK and the US. They're not based in Germany. And even some of the German banks, like Deutsche Bank, were quite hard hit because Deutsche Bank actually is more active in London than it is active in Germany. They say in Germany that Deutsche Bank does the standard banking, loans, and things like that in Germany, and they do the dirty stuff in London, which is quite accurate. And they lost a lot of money also. So all these firms were running out of money. They all had the idea, we own it for a few years, and then we sell these firms again. But then the problem was, if you own 90,000 units, and many of them owned more of these organizations, so some of them owned 300,000, 400,000 units of housing, and it's 2007, 2008, 2009, no one has money to buy up that many housing units. Because if you imagine, if you trade so many units in one go, there's a very small market. There's not an actual market the way a market is defined in economics. The market exists of 10 organizations like this. So it's not a fully functional market, and all of them are running out of money because it's crisis in New York and in London. So what happens, they are unable to sell the companies. They are also relying very heavily on debt. Most of these organizations bought the housing units either for 100% with debt or more than 75% with debt. So they have to pay off their loans because their loans are typically only for a few years, sometimes even only for 6 months. So they have to roll over the debt, but no one wants to borrow their money, wants to borrow them billions of money, billions of euros. So what happens is, what they do as a way out is to transfer their housing subsidiary into an independent firm that they then list on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. Because once you sell the stocks, you can of course sell them in much smaller quantities. So they first have the advantage of scale by being the only ones who can buy up 90,000 units in one transaction, and then they turn around that advantage and then turn it into something that individuals can buy. But actually then who buys most of the units are pension funds, as I mentioned before. So here we see at the end, and many of them also merge. So we see Deutsche Wohnen is one of them, and many other ones, Deutsche Ellington, and a few other ones that are smaller transactions that are not on the list. These are some of the big ones. Merged into Vonovia. Vonovia currently owns 355,000 housing units throughout Europe. They are looking to expand into the Netherlands, France, and Austria. They already have a joint venture with a French social housing company. So also the capital that comes originally. So these were some illustrations about how these things are interconnected. And you can already feel a little bit that this is not all going well. So I'm suggesting that this interdependence results in delinking and some volatility. And I will mobilize another example here that the people who were in São Carlos have already heard. This is the city of Milan again. The city that the project that I showed at the beginning, here is the Pirelli site, where there used to be the factory, and now there's a university, plus a mall, plus a theater, plus offices. But I'm actually looking at this site here in white, which is not in the city of Milan. So this is the border of the city of Milan. On the map you see the whole metropolitan area. And this is the city of Sesto, of fully Sesto San Giovanni. And in Sesto San Giovanni there was a huge steel factory called Falk. This was a big brownfield, but on the wrong side of Milan. The north and northeast of Milan is the old industrial belt, which is also known as the Red Belt, because there were two political options there. You could vote socialist or communist. But many of the cities were actually not very well run. There was a lot of corruption also taking place there. So it wasn't all great when the left-wing parties were running. But this means that you have all brownfields here, but in a city, I think it's 70 or 80,000 people, that is not very well run, that doesn't have a large planning department, while all the black dots you see here are in the city of Milan are the big projects. Milan is a city of 1.4 million people, metropolitan area of 4 million, so a bit smaller than Belo Horizonte. But they do a lot of big projects. This is the way they've been doing planning for the last 25 years. And we do many more of them than cities the same size in Europe. So you could compare to Vienna, that's bigger, or Brussels, that's a little smaller. They would not have as many projects. So Milan does many of them, and generally they do them quite well. They do put a lot of infrastructure in, but they also get relatively high quality projects. It's very easy to do a critique of what the city does in Milan, but although that critique would be valid, they do so much less worse than many other cities. And the city doesn't bankrupt itself. It demands a lot from developers at the same time about the quality they deliver, and they're able to put new areas on the map. They also roll out the infrastructure, new metro lines. They made a new train line under the center, so they've really used the projects to improve the city. But the city of Sesto is not able to do that because they don't have the manpower, they don't have the knowledge, they don't really know what happens. So again, a complicated table, but in the first line, you just see the years. In the second line, you see who owns the Falk site in Sesto at that moment. In the third line, you see the financial model. I'm not going to discuss that in detail. Then you see programming, so what are they planning to do with the brownfield sites? Then we see how much profit they expect to make, and in the last one, how much they paid for the land. So we see in 1990, the Falk Corporation leaves the land. They no longer have a steel factory there, and until 2000, they hold the land as a brownfield. So they didn't have any expected gains on investment. They were not planning to do anything there. They didn't think anyone would be able to do something there. They didn't buy the land at that moment. They already owned it for decades, so that's undefined. Then in 2000, what happens is that a local real estate developer known as Gruppo Passini is buying up the land, and they pay, where is it? They pay 140 million euros for the land. So if you do it times 4 and a little bit, the times 4 is easy, you more or less have the amount in reais. So this is the amount of 140 million they paid. But the interesting thing is they took out a bank loan for 200 million to buy the land for 140 million. So you can already see that it's not just that a lot of these investors buy with using a lot of debt. In some cases, they even borrow more than the actual cost. And the argument was probably you need more money because we're going to develop it. So they wanted to develop 700,000 square meters, and they wanted to make 9% profits according to their plans. Their plans are quite vague, and Federico Savini, a friend from Amsterdam with whom I looked together into this, we think the group never planned to do any project there. We think they only wanted the project to change the zoning of the land, and then with the changed zoning to sell the land for a higher price, because their plans, the way they were detailed, was not very good. We can't prove that they were not planning to do anything, but we have a lot of suggestions that they did. So what happens in 2005, 5 years later, exactly, that's one of the nice things here. Everything happens in 5 or 10 years, so it's easy. They sell to Gruppo Solino, which is a group of mostly national investors, so we see upscaling from the local level to the national level. And they sell the land for 298 million. You have to think 2005, this was in Europe sort of the high point before the crisis hit in 2007, 2008, where the sky was the limit and anything you could do will work. So this organization buys it. They actually make a down payment of 88 million. So they have almost the first 30% more or less they have in their own money. The rest they borrow. So they borrow less in this case. They try to do 1.1 million square meters. So we were before at 700,000. They want to make 15% profits. You have to imagine in a low interest rate environment, low inflation environment, 15% is extremely high. I can imagine in Brazil, there's different percentages that are used, also because inflation is a bigger risk and interest rates are probably higher. But in Italy at the time, the lowest interest rate ever and very low inflation. So 15% profit is extremely high at the time. And then what happens, then in 2010, they run out of money because the crisis hits. The crisis hits Italy definitely more than Germany. And they sell to another group, which is based officially in Italy, VC and Partners Holding, but the investors behind the holding are mostly international. And they sell, even though it's crisis, in 2010 is sort of the deep point of the crisis, the worst part of the crisis hits Southern Europe. Even then, they still pay, they sell the land for 405 million. So even between 2005 and 2010, the price of the land still goes up. And they use 60 million in cash, and the rest is all kinds of financial products. They want to do a slightly smaller project, just under 1 million square meters, and the profit rate goes down a little bit, 12%. So we see a few constants here. The level, so the scale of analysis goes up. We go from local to national to international. Then the second is the financial model that I didn't discuss. What you can see is that at the end it gets much longer, which means it gets much more complicated, because we had trouble just summarizing this in a few lines, but we thought it would be nice to do this. The project gets bigger at each phase until the crisis hits, then it gets a little smaller. The same happens with the profit. The profit expectations go up, and then it goes a little smaller. The land always increases in price. Even when the profit expectations are lower, and the project is going to be a little smaller, the land price still goes up. And in every phase, what happens is that they lobby the city to change the zoning to do whatever project they want. So we published this in 2016, but as we were about to publish it, what changed again is that the new investor came in. Now investors came in mostly from the Middle East. But again, a group, not just one investor, and they bought up the land, again for more money. And we think they're actually planning to do a project. But we're not entirely sure. They may sell the land again. So I'm not saying this is the same everywhere. As I said, this is very different from the city of Milan. But I think some of the tendencies we see here, we do see in other places. So what we see here is a decontextualization of the land use planning. The land use planning in this case, it's just whatever the developer asks, we do. And as I said, this is not everywhere. The city of Milan does not do this. They definitely facilitate developers, but not in the same way as they do here, where they have no good planning office. A lot of the best urban planners in Italy, some of them go to work for the city of Milan. They don't go to work for the city of Sesta. We see detachment between planning process at the local level and the logics of investors that go up to higher and higher scales. First national, then even at international and global level. And then Phil O'Neill, an Australian geographer, he has a nice line where he says that land is becoming an arterial route in the circulation of finance. He uses it in quite a different context, but just this one line, so I took it out of context here, I'm admitting that, I think fits quite well to what you see happening here. Especially in a case where some people borrow more money than they actually pay for the land, just to invest it somewhere else. So what we see is that the capital is not only flowing onto and through the land, as David Harvey argues, the land is increasingly used itself as collateral to make investment somewhere else. So it's no longer even just about doing real estate, although that's still important. It is also about suggesting you will do real estate investments, thereby changing the zoning, making the value of the land higher, the prices go up, and therefore you can use the land without ever doing any development. So it is no longer just a fix for the overaccumulation elsewhere, as Harvey argues. It actually becomes a site of new accumulation. It becomes a site of creation of debt. So my argument is not that Harvey is wrong, this is what some people understood when I said this thing before. My point is actually that Harvey is more right than he thought he was. This is going beyond Harvey. This is not like, oh, Harvey said this and it's something else. It's like, no, Harvey said this, and then there's a level now on top, because when Harvey wrote this was in the 70s and 80s, when he wrote about spatial fixes and overaccumulation, capitalism and real estate development. He doesn't talk in the same way about this in his recent publications, but this is at a new level. This is what's happening. So the land is being mobilized to create leverage, another way to say, to borrow money, to create credit, debt, and then to move the money elsewhere to seek profitable investment. This is not the only thing it does, but this becomes one of the functions of the land. So this was the first proposition. We go to the fourth, which is that real estate holds a special position within the contemporary financialized economy. As I told a few people before, I'm not going to use the word financialization too much, but I did that before in São Carlos. So my claim here is, and this is again very much David Harvey type of argument, is that the absorption of capital by real estate, which includes housing, but also offices and other forms of real estate, is one of the defining characteristics of contemporary financialized capitalism. I can't show it in detail. This is in itself a very long argument just to show this one bullet point, so I will just give a few illustrations rather than trying to build this up theoretically and completely lose my others. So what I argue is, still following Harvey, that the role of real estate in capitalism is to solve or manage, they're almost the same but not exactly, the capital absorption problem. And the capital absorption problem is basically, it's not the problem of too little money, it's the problem of too much money. What do we do with all the money that's being produced? I could have added some graphs about how the amount of money in the world has been growing much faster than the global economy. I could have included some figures about how much financial investors, how much money they make, which is also much more than the growth of the economy. But I think many of us know that these days. So I wanted to skip those graphs just by telling you now for 20 seconds, I say 5 minutes. And then Harvey, of course, argues that there's a spatial fix for the overaccumulation, that it's fixed in space. It is fixed quite literally because it's the material space, real estate is material, the land is material, but we see in a way that there's a transcending taking place of this materiality. The transcending takes place because the land is just a site for the money to go elsewhere. It becomes also, the materiality is in a way transcended because we have mortgage-backed securities. You don't need to be close to the house anymore. You can just buy a product where you have the rights for thousands or 100,000s of mortgages. In the REITs, you can just buy a stock in a REIT, and the REIT may own real estate all over the world. So there's all kinds of ways that the financialized economy tries to overcome these spatial figures, which is in a way part of the contradiction of capital. So again, I'm not saying Harvey is wrong, but I'm taking it a little further and saying this has changed a little bit. The spatial fix is still there, the money is still fixed in real estate, but it's not necessarily always the same money. Because you can trade a stock. If someone else wants to buy your stock, it's now someone else who buys it. So the money is still fixed, but the investors are no longer fixed. This is what happens then. And we've seen the growth of real estate debt, so especially mortgages, but also other forms of debt to developers, for instance, loans, is outpacing economic growth. And this is basically true everywhere. This is not just true in the global north. This is true, some of the extreme cases are actually from more from the global south, especially middle income countries. So Lebanon, in this way, is much more extreme, for instance, than, let's say, the Netherlands, where I'm originally from, or the US. So one example that I like a lot, move to the other side. You can look at the graph already, because it also allows me to take some water. So I don't use a lot of big data sets. I mean, some of the data I showed before is just existing data, but I'm not skeptical of other researchers using large data sets. So what happened here? These are some economists, partly at the Federal Reserve in the US, the Federal Bank, and they have numbers for 17 OECD countries, so it's basically North America, Western Europe, and Chile. And they have numbers, this is quite amazing, from 1870 to 2010. So in that paper, there's a lot of graphs for individual countries, for different types of lending, but this is the graph that brings everything together. And it compares throughout this 140 years, how much of it is non-mortgage lending compared to the size of the economy. So this is a weight average. I'm not going to explain all the details in large, but you can look it up. So this is lending to firms, to big corporations, but also to small entrepreneurs, you know, like shops in the corner or a little bar. This is lending to student loans, car loans. This is all lending, also lending to the government is a very important one. All forms of lending, except for lending based on real estate. In red, the line is just mortgage lending, and they have a definition that includes other types that are facing not called mortgages in some countries, but are in fact loans to make people possible to buy homes. So of course, they had to adjust a little bit for so many countries. So what we see is we would expect non-mortgage lending, all the other forms of lending are bigger than mortgage lending. And the lines go up together for a while, and then around the end of the around the First World War, we see that mortgage lending collapses, but actually regular mortgage lending is a little bit erratic, but it doesn't completely collapse. But quickly, also mortgage lending, or quickly after more than 10 years, it picks up again, and basically the line follows the same trend. Then we see around the Second World War, we see non-mortgage lending collapsing. And imagine many of these countries were not in the First World War, and several of them were also not even in the Second World War. So we see in the average non-mortgage lending collapsing, and during the Second World War, for a brief moment in time, there is more mortgage lending than all the other forms of lending combined, which is already quite interesting. Then what happens is that from 45 onwards, quite steeply, non-mortgage lending goes up. Mortgage lending takes a few more years, but then from the 1950s also starts going up. And then you see something happens around 1980. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and then, of course, in many other countries, also politicians that were implementing basically a lot of neoliberal policies And of course, Reagan is relatively important because if this is a weight effort, the US counts a little heavier than other countries because it's bigger than all other countries in the world. So we start seeing that this line graph going very steep and slows down a little bit. But again, this is an effort for so many countries, so it's quite amazing that you can see such a clear trend. And then around, what is it? Now I'm standing in front of it. Around the year 2000, there is for these 17 countries, which includes many of the biggest economies in the world, there is now more mortgage lending than all the other forms of lending combined. And then you see this little thing here. This is the crisis of 2007, 2009. And you see already, the graph only goes up to 2010, but between 9 and 10 it's already going up. And the graph stops here for 17 countries, but we know for many of these countries individually that the red line is going up much faster than the blue line. And we also know that many countries that are not in the OECD, for quite a number of years, also had the red line going up steeper than the blue line. Not in all countries surpassing it yet, but we see that in several Latin American countries, we see that in the Middle East, we see it in East Asia. So again, these middle income countries, we see quickly catching up with an explosion of mortgage lending, typically more erratic, because many of the economies are more erratic, more unstable. What we see in the long term for many of these countries, we see that mortgage lending is also growing faster than non-mortgage lending. Sometimes non-mortgage lending is quite stable while the other one goes up. One of the reasons that it happens, I'm just going to mention a few reasons. This is not an exhaustive list. There are a few factors at the level of mostly the global economy. And there's many, I'm not saying the national economies are not important and the urban economies, but to discuss them you have to look at individual countries, and I can't do that right now. So this is a list of a number of factors. So the first thing is what Gordon Clark from the UK, geographer, calls pension fund capitalism. Minsky, the economist, talks of money manager capitalism. But this is basically the amount of money being managed by pension funds, which is the largest form of institutional investors. Other institutional investors are insurance companies, and also capital by SWF, these are sovereign wealth funds. So we find them typically in East Asia and the Middle East, some of the biggest ones, but also Norway. So very often these are state funds that are managing whatever the economy is contributing. So very often it's based on oil, on gas, and East Asia it has to do with the tradition of more developmental economics. So we see that those ones, I mean I can't show the growth here, this is not in the, I don't have like an interactive graph, but these ones, the first two are growing much faster than any of the other ones. And they're growing faster than the world GDP. So we see that the world GDP per year is now smaller than the total amount that investors have. Of course, the one is measuring for a year, the other one is the stock, so it's very difficult to compare. But it's important that this one grows, but it grows slow. This one grows much faster. This one doesn't grow so fast, this one doesn't grow so fast. This one grows faster than this one, but slower than this one. So all this money has to go somewhere. This is what is the overaccumulation. You can talk about what happens in specific sectors, but where it really happens is in finance itself. And pension funds would also include not just the money from rich people, but would include a lot of the money from people who are in pension funds. I'm in a pension fund, so my money is also in there a little bit. Just a little bit. And then one example, and I pick here an example from the Netherlands, which sounds odd because it's such a small country, so on the global scale you would think it's not very important. But the third largest pension fund in the world is Dutch, which is actually, when I was still working in the Netherlands where I used to put my money in. Now I'm in the Belgian pension fund, but they still have a few euros. And you don't have to look at the different cars, but what you can see is basically the assets that they have under management, how they increased between 82, 92, 2002, and 2012. And I can tell you the Dutch economy did not grow this fast. Even when it grew fast, which in the Netherlands was not so much the early 2000s, but the mid and late 1990s, it was not growing, it was not doubling the economy. It was growing with 5% a year, which was very high for us. And it definitely wasn't growing between 2002 and 2012 much, because it first had the boom and then the bust. So we see the money they have to invest increases every year. And then what is the little black bar you see everywhere? That is in the beginning a relatively small part, a relatively big part of the small bar, but it doesn't increase. This black part is direct investment into real estate. So this is just owning buildings themselves as a pension fund. So this actually, not just the relative numbers, but an absolute number, they own less real estate directly. But then there's the other one, which is indirect real estate. that is this part. This is the gray part. And then you see that part is increasing both in absolute terms rapidly, but even in relative terms. So this means that, for instance, they own stocks in real estate investment trusts. So I couldn't show that before, and I can't still show the complete connection, but I can show for one of the biggest pension funds in the world that indeed they own a lot of indirect real estate. This shows it clear, actually. This shows the direct real estate, again in black, these little bars for different years, and you see it goes down a lot. And the indirect real estate, the last one, the last black bar is direct real estate, and the indirect, this is definitely this one. So it's this one is for pension funds, the indirect real estate. So this goes up, in 82 it's almost negligible, and this is what it is later on. It also shows it's for real estate insurance company, but relatively speaking they're much smaller. So this is not just the one Dutch pension fund, this is all of them. And again, even though a small country, relatively speaking, one of the largest pension systems in the world. Another reason is what Ben Bernanke from the US calls the savings cloud, or other people talk of global imbalances. So this has to be with some countries saving a lot of money, and some countries spending a lot of money, and they're not the same countries. So here we see countries with a very low debt level, for instance China, countries with a very high debt level, for instance the US. And again, there's other countries with a high debt level, but Australia might have a very high debt level, but I think 20 million or 25 million people live in Australia, so it's not that important. But the US is very important and China are very important because if they do very little or very much of something, it impacts on the entire global economy. So some people talk of the relationship between the US and China as Chimerica because the two are two sides of the same coin. And the high debt level of the US needs to be paid by someone who have the high savings on the national level, China. So this is very much related. And this is just one way the money has to flow around, not just for people who own money and people who need the money, but also it has to go between different countries, which means even more money flowing around the world. And then the third one is a more short-term perspective. This is what starts happening in the financial crisis, is that you find a lot of countries that have specific monetary policies, especially in Europe and in North America, although more important in Europe in this case, where the policy is to put the money press on, which that actually in the US is very important too, but at the same time not use more money in government. And that's not true for the US, but it's true for most EU countries. So we find on the one hand, we find basically a stimulus of the production of money. The European Central Bank at some point was printing 80 billion, was introducing 80 billion euros per month extra. And then we see at the same time that it's not going into government spending. So it's not an old solution that Keynes would have suggested when the economy goes down, the government spends more. In the US, it's a little bit true. In Europe, the government spends or the same or less. But the amount of money that is created by the government through the central banks, in Europe, the European Central Bank, in the US, the Fed, is increasing. And many other rich countries that are outside the system, like the UK or Canada, basically follow what the US and the ECB do. And then what we find at the same time, that there's a demand for what in financial markets they call high quality collateral. And what does it mean? Something that's a very low risk investment, but still gives a return of profit, of course. So there's only a few things that are considered low risk, which is government debt from countries that are considered rich countries that won't go bankrupt. So Germany is the favorite, the Netherlands is quite popular, Austria, Finland. And before the financial crisis, this included most of the euro area, but nowadays, for instance, Greece doesn't count anymore. So the amount of countries that are considered low risk between 2007 and now has decreased. And the countries that are considered low risk have austerity policies, so they're not printing new debt. They're just rolling over the existing debt, but the public debt doesn't really increase in those countries. So investors who have all this money, you saw the bars go up with the amount of money, they can't put their money into government debt. Because as a pension fund, and the same is true for insurance companies, they have to either put all their money in high quality collateral, so low risk investments, or most of it. It depends on the national regulation. In some countries, 75%, in some it's 95%. But most of the money needs to go there. The other thing they can do, some companies at the stock exchange are also considered high quality collateral. In the stock exchange, they call them blue chip companies. So these are big companies that are relatively stable even during a crisis. Their stocks might go down, but not as much as others. The amount of companies that are considered low risk is barely increasing. Again, it's increasing much less than the amount of money that needs to be invested. So where does all the money go to? It can basically go into real estate debt. It's one of the few things that is considered low risk. We can discuss if it's low risk or not, but it's quite irrelevant what we think in this room. It's more relevant what the investors think. And if the investors think that real estate debt, like mortgages, mortgage-backed securities, but indirectly also real estate investment trusts, are considered low risk, they can put their money there. The fourth sector that I put in gray, because I'm not going to discuss it in detail, is that the European Union is now even rolling out some of these models further. With something they call the Capital Market Union. They are trying to push mortgage securitization, so it was at the beginning of the crisis in the US, onto all European countries. Many countries in Europe either have no or very little mortgage securitization. The UK and the Netherlands have a relatively big market, but many other countries have a very small market. Italy has been growing, Spain quite a bit before the crisis. After the crisis, France and Belgium grew a lot, but many Eastern European countries have no market. Some other South European or Scandinavian countries have tiny markets. So the European Union wants to roll out this model further by making this possible and creating more real estate. All of money. So whether you follow Keynes or Minsky, or you follow the financial markets or Harvey, so in different literatures, different names for this. And it's quite amazing. If you explain David Harvey an idea of capital switching and overaccumulation to people in financial markets, they get it directly. If you explain it to an economist, they're like, no, man, if they're sort of classically trained economists, not more political economists, they have all kinds of issues, but people in financial markets completely understand. They're like, oh, that's what we call the wall of money. And what happens, the money goes looking for a safe haven, it's what they say in financial markets, or a spatial fix in the terms of Harvey. And what happens is that we see the financialization of real estate, especially housing, through all these things I've already discussed. And I have no clue what time it is, so I will...
I'll take your time.
Okay. So there's a few more slides that you can see. Hopefully not too many, because there's only a few more propositions. So of course countries follow very different pathways. I'm not saying this is the same everywhere, but it's also important. I already mentioned a little bit about regulation. This has been made possible through the state. I won't say too much about regulation. But this is one picture. I often start presentations with this picture if it's more about housing. And what it shows, two lines, again, very simple graph. And it shows one line here that goes up a lot. These are the housing prices. And the other line that's almost stable, going up a little bit, then down a little bit, which is average household income. And this happens to be a picture for Brussels, where I live. But I could have made this picture for almost any other city in the world. The line for the housing prices might go up a little steeper in some countries, a little less steep. The years might be a little bit different, but this is what we see almost everywhere if we look at the longer period. Sometimes not for a few years, but income in some places does go up, but then the income line might be going like this. And still we see almost everywhere in the world that these housing prices go much faster than income, which just means in the end that housing becomes less affordable. So although I'm saying there's lots of differences, it's important also to see that there's lots of similarities between countries. So what is often discussed in the literature is scenario number one, where people say like, oh, we have two countries, and whatever we're measuring here, the two countries become more similar. This is what we call convergence. Or scenario 4 is being discussed, where two countries, whatever we're looking at, they grow apart and there's divergence. So the whole literature about international comparison is often about scenario number 1 and scenario number 4. But Colin Hay, a British political scientist, he says that what is actually much more interesting than convergence versus divergence is what he calls common trajectories. And you see in both number 1 and number 4 there's different trends. In number 1, yes, they get closer to each other, but the one country goes down, the other one goes up. In number 4, the one goes up and they go down and they grow apart. So there's no common trajectory. But what he says is also happening, the two countries going closer to each other and they have a common trajectory, they move in the same direction, but this is the most interesting. And this is actually the one that we see a lot, is where we see a divergence. Two countries grow apart, but they have the same trends. In this case, a decline. If we look at many things related to real estate and finance, there's two lines going up, but the one steeper than the other. So you might have the real estate debt for the Netherlands. It would be starting quite high and going up very steep. Then you might have the real estate debt for, say, what country shall we do? So we do the UK. It starts also quite high, it goes up less steep. So the two lines are growing apart, So the Netherlands and the UK are becoming more different over the years, but they undergo the same trend of increasing debt. So if we just talk about this as divergence, we suggest that something different happens in these countries. But the interesting thing is something very similar happens in these countries. Once you start introducing more middle-income countries, Brazil, Argentina, Lebanon, Philippines, they will start from a much lower level if you compare them to any country in Western Europe or the US. But in many countries, we see for many of these trends lines also go. So it's very difficult to put many countries, both from the global north and the global south, in one picture, because the global south would all be here, you couldn't see the change, and the global north would be all over the place. So I just have global north countries. We actually have some middle-income countries here, plus more countries from the global north we didn't put in. This is not a correlation between things. These are two things that measure more or less the same thing, but according to different data sources. But what basically happens, in blue you see debt, mortgage debt or private debt, which is heavily overlapping in 2000. So all the countries are here. And then we see the same picture in 2010, and then we see that some countries are still there in red, but some are now over here. But even the countries that are still on the left bottom, they have all moved towards higher debt. So we see that, for instance, in France, the debt increases. So the line is going up. But we compare that to Denmark, and Denmark used to be somewhere here. We see the line goes up much further. So Denmark and France grow apart. They become less similar, but they have the same trend of increasing debt. I don't know if you saw the one exception. Germany is the only exception. Germany, the private debts and the mortgage debt go down between 2000 and 2010. If we look between 2010 and 2018, also Germany goes up. Plus the other thing that I showed earlier, what happens in Germany, a lot of the financialization doesn't just happen for mortgages, it happens through real estate investment trusts and other funds. So some financialization happens there too. So I said already quite a bit about city level, but I also talked a lot about the national level. And the examples from Milan and Sesto around Milan, I did a little bit more urban, but of course this is also organized further at the urban level. So I'll give another brief example. I will keep it brief also because of time, but also because people in Sao Paulo already knew that. So we'll give a Dutch example of where we had a relatively strong planning system, but we also had a very strong boom and bust scenario between the early 1990s and 2007. And what we see is that urban planning starts to focus much more on competitiveness. So the argument I make in a separate paper is about the shift from managerial governments to entrepreneurial and financialized governance. I won't make that whole argument here. But what we see is that a lot of municipalities, especially the cities, have municipal land banks that invest a lot in the land. And what they do is they use the land, they often buy it from developers and they sell it back to developers, and in the meantime they service the land and they charge extra for it. But also the land banks start buying up the land before the developers buy it up. So they can have a large part of the value increase. So at the beginning, quite a good idea. We buy it up before the developer does. So the government can realize the price increase rather than the developer. And they still sell to developers. They have no plan to do anything themselves. But originally, this land bank model was a model to do good planning. It was not a model to make money. But during the late 1990s, and especially the early 2000s, it becomes much more a model to make money. So between 2004 and 2008, in a country of 17 million people, 3.2 billion euros, so again times 4 you have AIs, is being made with this money and put into prestigious buildings. So a lot of cities are developing sports arenas, museums, theaters. So in many cases, buildings that are appreciated by the public, but these are not necessarily cities the size of Belo Horizonte or Milan. Some of these cities are 100,000 people, 200,000 people, and they build facilities for large cities. So this is quite a successful model. The cities are able to make money and put it into new public functions as long as the land and the real estate prices go up. But they take a lot of debt to buy the land, so they don't have billions of euros laying around. They have to borrow money from banks. They can borrow extremely cheaply, but they still need to borrow the money. And then what happens is that the economy goes down, population growth is very limited. They can't sell the land anymore. The developers in 2008 say, we are not interested, we don't need the land anymore. So what they start doing is developers don't use their land claims. A land claim is when the developers first sells the land to the government, they have the right to buy back the land after the government has served it. So the developers don't do this anymore, nor are the developers buying the land that they never owned but that the city wants to be developed. And then we see the same amount of money is being lost in the years of the crisis, 2009, 2013. The crisis arrives late in the Netherlands and is relatively slow compared to, say, Spain or the US. But housing prices do go down with 25%, so we see quite an effect. And many municipalities are then under supervision from the national government and austerity measures are implemented. And I'll do a little bit of a comparison with Brazil. It's mostly based on Sao Paulo and especially Rio de Janeiro. And we see the urban operations that many of you will know about. And what I found very fascinating was the CPAC, the Certificates for Additional Building Rights. I'm not going to explain it, I assume most of you know. But when we actually see a parallel between Brazil and the Netherlands here is that we see that entrepreneurial policies are introduced with financial means. In a completely different way in Brazil, the CPAC is a pure financial product made by the state, while in the Netherlands, it's not a financial product, it's a municipal land bank that is transformed from being a vehicle for urban managerialism to a vehicle to make money. So the instruments used in Brazil and the Netherlands are radically different, but in both cases we see a shift towards entrepreneurial policies with the help of financial tools, or in Brazil, literally a financial product. We also see a double role of the local government. They are regulating the land, but they're also using it to finance activities. Once you use the CPACs, you want to make money on the land, so you have an interest within the urban operations that being the developments that bring in the most money, and therefore you can sell the CPACs for the highest amount. In the Netherlands, we see something similar with the land banks, again, radically different in many other ways. And we see something also here, the public land is being used to ensure investor profitability and also market control. Again, I can't discuss the details here, you will know it for Brazil much better. And then in Rio de Janeiro, quite specifically, we see the FGTS buying up the CPACs. So then it is a severance fund, which is not a pension fund, but looks like a pension fund, buying up a public fund or semi-public fund, buying up the land. Although the fund is meant to promote social welfare, it becomes in the process start partnering with developers, so it becomes a partner of the developers, and it becomes what Harvey Mullins calls a structural speculator. And the FGTS in this process really becomes how he defines a structural speculator. So quite different in other cities in Brazil, I know. Also quite different than in the Netherlands, but we see some of these trends going on in different countries that are in some ways very different and in some ways very similar. And then we get to the conclusion slides. What I want to show also that this is not just the process we find in the global north. We find this very much in the global south. When I first heard about how the urban operation works and with the additional zoning rights, I haven't seen anything as extreme anywhere in the global north. So tax increment financing that they use a lot in the US is quite an advanced financial measure that you use in urban planning, but the CPACs go, I think, a step beyond this. And the only thing comparable that I've seen is in China, which is known as the Chongqing model, the city of Chongqing, one of the fastest growing cities in China. And all the cities are growing fast in China, so this one even more. This is being a model being rolled out to other cities, which is quite similar to what you see in Brazil. So the Chinese postdoc with the Brazilian former PhD, now also a postdoc, they are actually doing a comparative paper now together, where they will see how similar the Chongqing model really is to the model of urban operation and CPAC, and if there's been any influence from the other one. In China, it's a relatively new model. Of course, in Brazil, this has been rolled out for decades, the urban operations. So it would be interesting to see if the Chinese took any inspiration from the Brazilians. We don't have any evidence so far, or they don't have any evidence, but there are striking similarities between the two projects. So of course, it doesn't mean it's all the same. That's why I had this last slide with the short comparison between the Netherlands and Brazil. There's striking similarities, and yet they're radically different at the same time. But we see a sort of a general mechanism going on. There's a wall of money, excess capital, or whatever we want to call it, but sometimes I like to use the words of the investors rather than the words of different theories, because then someone is going to argue against a Marxist term, and then I use the Keynesian term, and someone else argues against that. If you use the market term, then it's easier just to be away from the theoretical debates or battles. So that money has to go for a large part into high quality collateral, because most of the investment is not from individual rich people, most of the investment is pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies. This is where most of the money is. And this leads to real estate becoming increasingly financed in all kinds of different ways, and not at the same pace everywhere, but it does at this pace. And this means that cities are no longer seen as a fix for overaccumulation elsewhere, as Harvey argues, but urban land is also mobilized to create leverage, credits, and seek profitable investment elsewhere. Which I showed to the Milan case, but there's other cases that show parallel processes. This high debt model is very unstable. It's a political drug. When Harvey explains the spatial fix in one of his papers, he also says, like, the spatial fix is not just because it's fixed in the land, it's also because a fix is what happens when, if you're addicted to something, you put a needle in your arm, this is also a fix. Or if you're addicted to chocolates, you eat a lot of chocolate, you say, I have my chocolate fix now, I feel better, but you only feel better temporarily. With the chocolates, the effect of the next day is not so big, but over the years it does add up. But of course, if you put a needle in your arm, the effect is very, very strong. So this is also a fix. So this is how a fix is used as a metaphor in English, and this is very much how Harvey uses it. So in a way it's a drug, but it's a political drug. People are very happy when the housing prices go up. People are not happy if their children can't afford a house, but of course, these are one and the same process. And very weird, in many places, if prices for food go up, we think it's a bad thing, but many people think it's a good thing if prices for housing go up. These are the two basic necessities that everyone has: housing, shelter, and food. So why do we think that housing prices going up is a good thing? This is a bad thing, but people who think that they own real estate is a good thing. But then what they just need to buy more expensive houses later on, and they need the money to support their children, because the housing prices are not so high. So this allows political, but in a way also economic elites to overcome some of the contradictions of capital. But of course, this is always temporary. This is always a temporary process. You can try to overcome the contradictions, but then the contradictions will turn against you in the future. So yes, we saw some slowing down in the financial crisis for some countries, but at the same time we see new countries opening up. For those of you who were Sao Carlos, Ivana Sokolov presented on Argentina, which had many years of almost no real estate debt, no growth, and then in the last 2 years, real estate debt blows up, real estate investment trusts become possible, and we see also this happening. Another, I mentioned Lebanon briefly in the beginning. Lebanon is a very interesting case, where probably of middle-income countries, it has the highest real estate debts per capita. And what they did also, they tried to overcome the crisis by printing a lot of new money while keeping inflation low, which is kind of amazing about the Lebanese model. It has almost zero inflation. The Lebanese lira has been pegged to the US dollar for 15 or 20 years without ever changing. So it's, monetarily speaking, it's a very stable system, but the economy in many other ways is not so much. So what they do now is blowing up the real estate bubble to keep the economy going, as many other countries have done. In Ireland, where there was a big decline of the economy, similar to Spain, but Spain is much more well documented internationally, possibly because it's also a much bigger country, but in many ways quite similar. We see that they do exactly the same thing now. They try to build a lot of new real estate and they jump up the prices. It is more expensive now to live in Dublin than in some parts of Paris, for instance. It's not London prices yet, but Paris and Dublin are becoming very similar in price. But Dublin doesn't have the economy of a semi-global city like Paris, and definitely not like London. A friend of mine, she wanted to do research in a working class neighborhood in inner Dublin, and she has a postdoc grant from the Irish government, and they pay more than most postdoc grants elsewhere in Europe, and she couldn't afford a room in the poor working class neighborhoods because it was too expensive already. Many people who lived there, who still were able to live there, had rent stabilization, rent control, public housing, but you just rent a room in the poor neighborhood was no longer even possible. So it's not just new countries opening up, but some countries also relying on the open world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. Questions? Words? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
See, thank you.
Yeah, I will.
Because of the microphone.
Yeah.
So, May I ask if there's any hope for going out of this financial and real estate and political mess? I mean, it seems to me that the system is kind of invincible and only getting stronger down.
The short answer is, I think there's little hope. I think it will take at least one more crisis before things change. I mean, there's lots of initiatives that happen to counter this. But I think the problem with a lot of them is that either they're so small and they're not really expanding large enough to really have an impact, or when they do become more successful, they often become taken over by the private sector and they become part of that model. Just like a lot of the models of what we would think, oh, we have the sharing economy, it's great, we can share cars, we can share, and now this is just becoming new capitalism. So we see a lot of these things also from bottom-up movements. If they become bigger, it's often very difficult to run them completely bottom-up. So some form takes place of subsumption or whatever you want to call it, where it's very difficult. I think one of the places where we see, at least the places I know, of course most of the world I don't know, but one of the places that we see some new developments is Spain. So in Barcelona, as a city, there's a lot of big protests, but they've tried to change the model, but it goes very slow. But in Spain, more interesting is actually Basque Country, that for many years has been having many cooperatives. They have been, some of them have been active since the 1950s and 60s, and they scale up very slowly, so they don't become taken over by huge capitalist corporations. But this takes decades. And Basque Country was also hit in the financial crisis, but not as hard as Catalonia or the regional cities around Madrid that were the hardest hit. So I think there is some hope, but I think a lot of pessimism is necessary as well.
Thank you, Manuel, for this very interesting talk. I have not really a question, but 3 topics which I would like you to comment if you like to. So the first one is more theoretical. You've mentioned a lot of Harvard, and I think it brings up, at least to me, the idea of land rents in the category of land rent. So I'd like to say something about how you think and this concept, this idea can be used or to make sense of the real estate financial complex. The second has to do more with thinking about global south cities, which I think there are many differences. And one of them, which is quite important here, is the existence of large informal land markets. So, saying how can we adapt or make sense of financialization of the real estate financial complex, taking into account the fact that most of our cities are informal and we don't have really complete, secure, and clear private land titles, which seems very important for this kind of things to work. And the third question is, which one is quite fascinating, how this idea of real estate financial complex shows how actors in different kinds of capital are more entangled than ever before. And at the same time, it's kind of messy. We have this traditional background of thinking about property, capital, banks, financial system, and everything seems so mixed up right now. So are we moving to a new typology, a new kind of characterization of different kinds of capital, different kinds of economic actors? So if you could comment on that direction.
Okay. 3 big questions. Sorry. No, it's fine. I will try not to take too much time, but we can talk more later if you like. So land rent, yes, it's super important. I mean, I could have put everything in the theory on land rent, and I have a paper where I do a literature review on land rent together with one of my PhD students, and it was very useful to do, but I always find the problem with land rent. Yes, I can put everything in those terms, but I'm not sure if it explains more. So, yeah, I agree that it's a useful way to analyze it, but then I'm like, yeah, I'm just saying like, oh, in all these cases, the value of the land goes up. And I can say like, oh, in this case it's differential rent, it's one differential rent, 2, or monopoly rent. But I'm not sure how much additional explanatory power it has, unless I'm looking at one particular project, where you can say like, this is where monopoly rent was created in these kinds of ways. So yes, it's very useful. I agree with the ideas behind it, but then it doesn't bring me much further in trying to understand this at a different level of analysis. Many different global south, large informal land markets. Well, of course, you have a lot of people, especially in Latin America, who try to push towards more formal land markets, and with the idea that then everyone can get mortgage loans or other types of loans. Like, oh, it's great if you own your own land, you can borrow against it. And this is maybe one of those cases, like, it's bad to be included in the global capital system, but it's probably the only thing that's worse is not being included at all. So this is really a difficult question, because what you see, also with Mia Casa Mia Vida, is that a lot of people are dragged into debt that before had no access. So it's nice, and many of them are quite happy with their new house, but their house is in the periphery, they're far away. Some of you have probably written about that. But at the same time, they're pulled into debt. So I find it very hard to say what is better, to have the formal land market with the debt, or to have no formal land market and to have no debt. And I can't choose between those two. And I think for some people, having a formal land market with debt is a huge improvement in their life. But in some people, if they're dragged into the debt and they lose whatever income they have, which is probably also not in the formal labor market, but in many cases also informal, so it's even more insecure, the risks become even bigger. So the risk will increase, but also the way to upgrade your living situation is also, in potential, is great. So it's very difficult to say what happens there, but I think it's important that, and this is not just happening in Latin America, but I think some of the most loud voices, globally speaking, about making informal land markets formal are from Latin America. But the same happens in Africa, for instance, in some countries, not in all countries. And yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to fully include it, and I'm not sure where I stand in the debate. Actors are more entangled than ever before. It's becoming really messy, yes. That's indeed what I try to show. I think there is some new typology emerging, but I think it will take 20 years before we can say what the typology looked like in 2018. So I'm trying to develop some of those ideas, and I'm still having to bring together all these different pieces where I now just showed you like, one level analysis, one place, and different places. I want to try to bring them all together, but it will take me a few more years, so be patient.
Another question?
I know it's late. I talked for a long time.
Okay, I have one question.
Okay.
I know you don't want to talk about the financialization after São Carlos, especially after Liza was questioning you about your concept of financialization, I understand. But in the end of the seminar, all of us are asking if there is a financialization process in Brazil, especially talking about São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, it's one thing, and then we go to Belo Horizonte, even though we are a metropolis, it's another thing. And then we have the small medium cities in Brazil, which are quite different. And we are all talking about this after the seminar. And I understand we have CEPACs in São Paulo. We also have the introduction of new financial instruments everywhere, in different cities. And also we have the Uberland as a resource for profitability, the things that you have mentioned in your presentation there. And but we have asked these, especially in the bar that we went, are they sufficient to say that this financialization exists in Brazil? So I was asking after Liza talked about the concept. Can we say the definition about the financialization? Maybe it's a good exit to escape from this definition which says that's the one. That's the one. It was quite
I put a few extra slides in case there were some questions.
Yes, it was quite a point of debate in this summit that we had in São Carlos. So I would like to talk about a little bit about this. Maybe it's a theoretical operator. Maybe it could be a good idea.
So I'm going to think out loud now. So two things. First of all, the definition I have here is very good in some ways and very bad in other ways. I think why it's a good definition is because it's trying to connect the different streams of financialization. There's discussion about financialization at the level of the macroeconomy, as I discussed with the graphs in the beginning for US and UK. There's discussion about financialization at the level of the household, mortgage debt, and things like that. Also, people reasoning much more according to financial logic than other logics. There's discussion of financialization at the level of individual firms. Pirelli is a nice example, or General Motors, how they become more like financial firms, but also the way that companies make profits. I have another example on a slide that I won't get into, from a very mundane German company that's not on the stock exchange, it's not a multinational, but they make cash registers. And that they realized at some point that to move around money from different currencies is easier to make money than to make cash registers, to market them and sell them. So they were making more money a year moving the money around between different markets in which they were selling the cash register than purely selling the money. So they were holding reserves logically. This is also a way of financialization. So what the definition does, it brings all these different levels together. So at the level of abstraction, at the high level of abstraction, I think it's a useful definition to keep all these processes together. Because what happens at the level of the macro economy is not unrelated from what happens at the household level. It's not really easy to draw all the lines. That's why in the beginning I was at some point talking about, you have the real estate investment trust, and you have to believe me, there are pension funds investing it, and then later on, okay, I have now a pension fund, look where they put the money in. So you have to make the arguments, put little things together. But this is not an empirical definition. This is not an operational definition, I also would have said. If you want to say, I want to look if urban development in Brazil is financialized, you need to pick elements from this. You have to say, am I going to look at actors? Am I going to look at financial tools? Well, if I look at financial tools and I look at urban operations, then for Rio and for Sao Paulo, yes, they're definitely financialized. Yes, these are only 2 cities in Brazil, but these are by and large the 2 largest cities. They take up a large part also of the economy, even more than the population that you get. So even though these are only 2 cities, I think this is very significant for urban development in Brazil as a whole. And especially since the model is being rolled out to other cities. As I understand, also some of the mid-sized cities are very active in wanting to use the same tools. So this may be something that's still increasing. Also, financialization, as the last part of the word suggests, is a process. So it's not about yes or no. It's about, do we see a process where we see an increasing importance of financial actors, banks, hedge funds, private equity funds, real estate investment trusts that we also see active in some Brazilian cities, market practices, measurements, narratives. So all these things you can see, and you can have financialization in one indicator and not in the other one. So I'm not saying you should answer the question yes or no, but you have to pick up elements and then say, yes, we see some of it here. But for me, the interesting question is not yes or no, the interesting answer. The interesting would be, why do we see it? How do we see it? What exactly is going on with the CPEX? What exactly is going on in Minha Casa Minha Vida? Yes, these are relatively small amounts of debt if you compare them to rich people and the loans that they can take out. But if you look at the level of the household, this is a huge impact. So even though the loans from Minha Casa Minha Vida and at the macro level, even for Brazil, may be relatively small impact, and internationally almost invisible, at the level of the households, for a whole group of people, a whole class of people where almost no one in the past had loans, I think this is a huge difference. So then again, if you look at the household level, in this case, a particular class of people, I do think there is some financialization in Brazil. If you look at the level of companies, I have no clue. I know there are some Brazilian economists and economic geographers who look into this, and I think there's a little bit of evidence for it, but it's not as pronounced as it is in some other countries yet. But again, for me, that's not a surprise, because especially in a country in a different economic situation and with much more ups and downs in the economy, you would expect the picture to be much more erratic. But even in a rich country like Germany, you see that it was the only country that I had in the data set, and as I said, there were more that I didn't show in the graph, where mortgage debt was decreasing. So even in global north countries, you may see some contradictory results, where differentiation of rental housing in Germany is more pronounced than anywhere else in the world. But of mortgages, it's one of the least pronounced in the global north. And for German companies, there's somewhere it's really happening, but not as much as say in the UK. So also, it's not just the global north versus global north, or Brazil versus another country. I think even within the whole set of countries, you will see striking differences. If you start comparing Argentina to Brazil, it will be a very big difference, because Argentina, the economy did so much worse for many years. So the difference in the level of the economy has been going so much different. The type of projects that have developed, the policies that have developed in Brazil, the rollout of differentiation have very much state that. And Argentina maybe doesn't have them yet, because they didn't have the opportunity in the same way to do it as Brazil. The example I mentioned for Lebanon, you see something also through the state happening. So some people I know have also argued that there's no financialization in Brazil because the state does it. For me, that's an irrelevant. It's very relevant that the state does it, but the question if it does the state or not doesn't mean it's no financialization. It's state-led financialization, but this is again not unique to Brazil. This happens in many other cases, but maybe in Brazil it's more pronounced in certain ways. Especially also with an actor like the FTTS involved, which I'm fascinated by the FTTS. I think this is more, I hope there's going to be more studies on the FTTS. I know some people are working on it, but for me, this is one of the key to understand what happens in Brazil is to understand the FTTS. I'm moving away from your question, so I'll keep it back.
That's okay. Thank you. Any other question? No? Vai, Bruna, faz assim. I'm a bit shy.
You can
That's
do
why I
it if you would. Oh no, this one.
No, I see.
Okay.
You can.
Me and André, we were in a meeting in a housing council. I don't know how to say that. A housing council, like
Housing what?
Housing, like it's a group, it's a place from the local mayor, the local council.
Local council, okay.
Local council,
Yeah.
housing local.
we are presenting like a alternative program of like social rent, and it was really hard there because here in Brazil we have a very strong resistance because of that you say that was like a political drug. Like everybody here, like the social movements, they want to assess housing through ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really hard to, introduce like not commodified housing.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, and Minha Casa Minha Vida, it's an example, and we knew like this afternoon that 10% of the Minha Casa Minha Vida stock is empty here
In Belo Horizonte.
in Belo Horizonte because of a lot of factors that we don't know, but people are not satisfied with the house, as you said. It's really hard to understand which is worse, if it's like the informality or the Minha Casa Minha Vida stock. But at the same time, we have like this so strong resistance in another programs.
Yeah.
And I would like to know how do you see like the whole of the not commodified housing in this process of financialization?
So I think the resistance against decommodified housing is, I don't want to say global, but it's very common in many countries. In Ireland, that I mentioned before, most people don't want more social housing, even though a lot of people are too poor to afford it. So, and they have some social housing, but it's definitely not the most for a Western country now. So I think that trend is very common, although it will have different shapes in different countries. And then, of course, we see places like Germany, where you have a large decommodified housing stock, which is then being completely financialized. In the Netherlands, which built more social housing, relatively speaking, than any other country in the world, more than any socialist or communist state. At some point in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, in the 1970s and 80s, more than 90% of the new housing was social housing. But even that is partly being privatized. And even when it's still run as social housing, it's not owned by the state in most cases. And we see financialization processes taking place within these organizations. We see the same in the UK. There are colleagues in the UK who work on this, Joe Perry, Tom Wainwright, and they look, for instance, at the effect of housing associations taking out not loans from government-owned banks, but participating directly in capital markets, which may be the capital market in London, but that means the global capital market. And they see effects on how the organization is run. And cost effectiveness becomes much more important, profit considerations become more important. So you see a financialization of the rationale of how a non-profit is run, even though the non-profit is still technically non-profit. And we see something similar in the Netherlands with similar type of products, but also in the Netherlands there were housing associations that were buying derivatives. So derivatives can be a form of insurance, but they can be the most toxic financial product possible. One of them had to be bailed out for 2 to 3 billion euros, which is more than one of the biggest failures of banks in the world. Barings Bank was, until the financial crisis, one of the biggest bank failures, was less than a few billion. So we talk now about, this allows you a few billion euros. So a lot of these things can happen even within these organizations. So to the earlier question, is there any hope? Yes, there are some new initiatives, but you see that even in some of these organizations, especially once they become bigger, more institutionalized and more tied to both the government and the financial sector, usually the both together, because that's how you become institutionalized, we see some of the same processes taking place. I still think it's better to live in the housing from the housing association in London with the profit consideration than having to find something in the private market in London. But it's not the same housing association anymore as it used to be. And affordability becomes a different kind of concept than what it used to be before. So I think it's very important that there's more of these decommodified housing alternatives. And I think it's important that on the one hand, there is support for bottom-up initiatives, cooperatives and things like that. Tenant cooperatives, for instance, in Germany are very popular. But at the same time, also state-provided housing, state-provided subsidies. There's a lot that we see in critical social science that has become very anti-state, and it's very much about, people have to do it themselves and bottom-up initiatives. I think we really need both. And I think also it's better to bet on 2 horses than on just one. And I think also the problem is too large for it just to be solved with bottom-up initiatives. Because as I mentioned from the Basque Country example, the rolling out of it is very slow and takes decades. So yes, we need those initiatives, but the state needs to do more as well. And it's not that the state doesn't have the money, because it spends a lot of money on other things. It spends a lot of money on fiscal subsidies and all kinds of shit, but so the money is there. Even in poor countries, there is money there because it's being spent on other things. And some of the incentives don't necessarily have to cost a lot of money. What I understood from some of the earlier operations is that some of the money that was being made in the urban operation was invested through an urban fund in other areas to put into infrastructure. That's what I understood from colleagues in Sao Paulo, like Liza that you mentioned. So some of those things happened in the past without the government putting tax money in it, but just redistributing the money made in one area to another area. So Brazil has done it in the past, but then with newer policies for urban operation, the money made with the CPAC has to be reinvested in that area. It doesn't have to be that way. You can just change the regulation. That's not easy, but it's possible. It's possible even without any money to do it.
What do you think about pricing policies like increasing property taxation to empty apartments, and what is the international experience of that?
I don't know enough about an international experience, I didn't look at it at all. I know some countries do it. I know some specific cities have also started to do more of this. Vancouver, for instance. I think it's good to tax empty property because if someone owns it, someone is wasting the property. And there might be places where there's too much property because the city is shrinking. We see this in old industrial regions in the global north. Detroit, Liverpool, parts of Germany are emptying out. Many parts of former socialist Europe have empty regions. I think there it might not be the best policy because people are not having the property empty because they want to make more money or speculate. They just have it empty because there's not enough demand. But I think in places, and this is a larger part of the world, where demand is bigger than supply, I think it's good to tax these properties more. I think that the impact is limited of doing this, but the limited positive impact is better than no impact whatsoever. So we see in places like Vancouver, we see very much that it's the rich people from elsewhere buying the properties there. We see that in other cities, and we see it very much in global cities like London and New York, but where we see it the most is not in the largest global cities, but it's places like Vancouver, Melbourne, Sydney, and a lot of it is East Asian, predominantly Chinese capital going in there. And Vancouver is trying to change this by taxing it higher. But the average price for a flat in the city of Vancouver is already $1 million Canadian, which is a little less than American dollars, but just a little. And it's not a rich city. So again, this policy may have a small effect, but yeah, better than nothing.
No?
No, it's just passing the microphone.
Any other question? No? Manuel, I'd like to thank you again for your generosity to come here to Belo Horizonte and give this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Obrigada a todo mundo.